This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. But the podcast, well, we're here, as the title suggests, to talk of the stories of films. So what I look at in this podcast are production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, all kinds of little tales in and around the world of movies. What I tend to focus on is generally quite mainstream films. They're films that I have an interest and stroke or I'm invested in to some degree. I don't do snark. I'd say I'm afraid I'm not. I'm glad I don't do snark. And the two films that I'm going to talk about in this episode, well, I think they're two really good movies. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you a snippet from the first of those, from the trailer of it. We're going back to 1993, and here's that little clip. I'll pick up the story the other side of that.
Yeah.
Frank Oregon?
Yeah.
I've read about you, seen photos. You were JFK's favorite. Dallas. What happened to you that day?
And this time, he'll be ready.
I see you, Frank. I see you standing over the grave of another dead president.
That's not gonna happen.
There you go. He's still the Judge Dredd, the best Judge Dredd we never got, isn't he? That's Clint Eastwood and John Malkovich and Rene Russo headlining In the Line of Fire from 1993, directed by Wolfgang Petersen, and the screenplay sole credited to Jeff Maguire. The story of this one, though, actually goes back to the late 1970s and to movie producer Jeff Apple, and he was 15 when he first saw the presidential motorcade back in Miami in 1964. And when he was watching it, he was taken with the image of the Secret Service agents who were running alongside the limo. And it was only as he parked the idea in his head for a bit, and then towards the end of the 70s, he thought about trying to gel that into a story. And ultimately, it was in the early 80s, in 1983, when he decided he was in a position to try and do a movie. And so what happened? Well, at that stage, it was a very, very small independent project that he was looking to put together. And he managed to accrue enough funds to hire a screenwriter, a friend of his by the name of Ken Friedman, who he'd known at his time at New York University. New York University is where Jeff Apple attended, and also he was part tutored by Martin Scorsese while he was there. But Friedman then he took about a year and a half to put together what would be the first screenplay for what became In the Line of Fire, and they got a workable draft together. And so in the mid-1980s, they decided then to start shopping it around to see if they could attract any kind of interest to the project. And the thing is, They did get some interest, in particular from British director Michael Apted. And Michael Apted at this point he put together a reputation off the back of the success of Coal Miner's Daughter back at the start of the 1980s. Later on in the decade, he would do Gorillas in the Mist. He would also, of course, go on to do one of the more infamous James Bond films, The World Is Not Enough. I might come to that one in a future podcast. But when Michael Apted got hold of Ken Friedman's screenplay, he liked the idea, but he wanted to do some changes. Nothing uncommon there, of course. A director coming aboard a project will generally want to put their own stamp on the script to some degree. But things seem like they were fairly quickly coming together in the mid-1980s for the film. That what happened too was Dustin Hoffman, Jeff Apple heard, was looking around to possibly do some kind of Secret Service-centric movie. And, well, that was in the line of fire. So Jeff Apple somehow got that project to him. Hoffman expressed his interest in it. He signed on the dotted line, so they had Michael Apted interested, they had Dustin Hoffman interested, and that was a package that a studio was thus interested in. And in came Columbia Pictures, then owned by the Coca-Cola Company, who agreed to put forward the funding for the movie. So it looked like full steam ahead. What could possibly go wrong? Glad you asked. In June 1986, one of the most infamous appointments in Hollywood happened, and this was when British movie producer David Putnam was appointed the new boss of Columbia Pictures. It would be a very infamous, just over a year-long tenure he would have in that job, that Putnam would ruffle the feathers of lots and lots of talent. He was one of the reasons that Ghostbusters 2 took an awful long time to happen, because people like Bill Murray had their they had their backs put up by Putnam and comments that Putnam had made, and instead Putnam used his tenure at Columbia to advance projects like The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which for Terry Gilliam, which would go on to be a fairly infamous flop at that point. As it turned out, Putnam and Dustin Hoffman had there was a disagreement really, in that one of the projects that Putnam had criticised quite openly was Ishtar. Again, a notable Hollywood flop of the 80s, and at the point where you couldn't make your money back from video, DVD and Blu-ray in a hurry, Ishtar had lost an awful lot of money. Putnam had been pretty scathing of the film. Hoffman was not happy with Putnam for being pretty scathing of the film. Hoffman made it be known that with David Putnam at Columbia Pictures, he wasn't going to star in the lead role of Frank Horrigan in the Line of Fire. And it was that simple. The appointment of a studio head stopped that movie happening and going into production in the mid to late 1980s. Putnam, incidentally, his tenure would not last long, but nonetheless, it was a done deal at that point. There was no going back. So the movie found itself back in turnaround, and it was around this time that Jeff Apple got in touch with he got talking to a friend of his, Jeff Maguire, a screenwriter who had been through a tough time, who has given interviews in the past where he talked about how he's basically living off his credit card for about half a decade, just trying to make a living out of screenwriting, that no one was buying his scripts. But what happened was Maguire and Apple had a conversation, and Maguire came in and he put a slightly different spin on the film. Now, by this point, the project had briefly come back up at Warner Brothers, with the view then of getting could Dustin Hoffman be lured back to the film? But for Hoffman, the ship had sailed. Instead, he committed to making Rain Man instead, and that would prove to be quite a good career move for him, really. That brought him Oscar attention and brought him a box office hit. But for Jeff Apple, his film was still in limbo. So next up, and this is where Jeff Maguire comes in, was Hollywood Pictures. And Hollywood Pictures, of course, was a subsidiary of Disney. It was to do, quote, adult fare for Disney, but not that mucky stuff, so calm your minds. And it was at the recommendation of basically a Hollywood Pictures executive, that the picture was rewritten again. And so this brought in some fairly crucial changes to the movie. In particular, the changing of the age of the character of Frank Horrigan. That in the original drafts that were done by Ken Friedman, that Horrigan was around his 50s at that point, which took out the backstory which became crucial to the film, that Horrigan was working the day that JFK was assassinated and has been haunted by this for the rest of his working life. That wasn't in the original script, but when Jeff Maguire came in and decided to make the character older, make him in the character of Horrigan now in his 60s, that JFK backstory came back into play. And that was interesting. Various other people at this point. So Robert Redford was one of the candidates in line as a possibility, as was Warren Beatty, but they couldn't really be lured into the film, and they both passed on it. Also, one other candidate to play the role of Horrigan in the movie was Sean Connery, and Sean Connery had won his first and only Oscar towards the back end of the 80s for The Untouchables, which I covered in a previous episode of the Film Stories podcast. It wouldn't be me if I didn't plug somewhere along the line a back episode of this particular enterprise. But Sean Connery had a decision to make about which project he wanted to make. He was in demand at that time for quite a lot of leading roles, and he opted to go with quite a contentious choice that came out the same year, Rising Sun with Wesley Snipes, based on the book by Michael Crichton. Came out the year of Jurassic Park as well, the two Michael Crichton novels that were adapted. One did slightly better than the other, and in fact Rising Sun is a candidate for a future podcast as well, so I'll park that for the minute. But I've just got a little bit ahead of myself, because when Hollywood Pictures couldn't then get the project moving, the next company that was interested was Imagine Entertainment, and this is the production company of Ron Howard and Brian Grazer, primarily set up their projects at Universal Pictures. And Imagine was interested in the film, but it had a crucial change to it that it wanted to make, in that it wanted to bring the age of the character of Frank Horrigan down, because it had an eye on someone like Tom Cruise in the lead role, and they thought that would be a much easier film to sell. Instead, Jeff Maguire and Jeff Apple were resistant to that, though, because as soon as you make that character younger again, you lose that backdrop. You lose the Kennedy assassination and how that haunts the character of Horrigan right throughout the film, and the thought of him, the fear really of him being on duty again when something that horrific happens. In fact, Jeff Maguire had been inspired by the real-life story of Clint Hill, who was one of the agents who was protecting that day, protecting JFK on that horrible day in 1963. And he had given an interview in the 70s where he talked about what it was like living with that. And that's something that Maguire drew on to really shape the character of Frank Horrigan in the movie. After Imagine Entertainment had put forward its suggestions, and those have been passed on, then things suddenly came together very, very quickly for the movie. And so by now we're coming to the early 1990s, and Jeff Maguire had honed this script, and basically without some studio development money behind it, this was a spec script. This was a screenplay that had been written without any studio ordering it in the first place, with the idea of taking it out and hoping one of the studios would be tempted to snap it up. As it happened, Maguire signed up with a new talent agency in the early 1990s, and it was in 1992 when said talent agency decided to put the spec script back into the market, and a bidding war soon got underway for it. And as it would happen, the production company Castle Rock, headed up by director Rob Reiner, who had just come off a huge hit with A Few Good Men at the time, well, they snapped up the script for $1.4 million. This was a good big signing for them. And then things at that point came together really rather quickly. So this is April 1992 now that the screenplay was bought, that Castle Rock handed over its money. Within days, Clint Eastwood's agent was in touch, expressing interest in taking on the role of Horrigan. Now, Eastwood had, it's not the first time the role of Horrigan had come before Eastwood, but previously he felt that the character was too young for him. Whereas this time, Eastwood was now at a better age to play the character, and he's got a history really of hanging around waiting until a character fits him. He notoriously sat on David Webb People's script for Unforgiven for a good decade before he felt he was in a position to be able to play the character. And in the case of In the Line of Fire, when it came back to him with a version of the character of Frank Horrigan who was in his 60s, well, that was far more interesting to Eastwood, and the deal was locked down within a matter of days as a consequence of that. Eastwood, as part and parcel of the deal, got director approval, and this was an unusual project for Eastwood to attach himself to for a couple of reasons. Number one, he directed at this stage in his career pretty much every film that he was starring in. Number two, in fact, and that will continue afterwards, number two, virtually all of his films had been set up at Warner Brothers. And he had his production company, Malpaso, was long set up at Warner Brothers. And for him to go off and do a picture for another another studio. Well, that was quite a thing, and also one that he wasn't going to direct and would just take purely an acting role in. Now, Eastwood at this point, I just mentioned Unforgiven. He was just coming off directing Unforgiven, so at that point he hadn't won his Best Director Oscar that he would get for that movie, but he had just made the film, and he was about to have a sizable box office hit and win Oscars for a Western. He, therefore, having director approval, that was mildly intimidating for the director who was ultimately chosen. And they zeroed in on Wolfgang Petersen, who then had come to the attention of most people off the back of the exceptional Das Boot, started as a television project. And there's a television version, a director's version, a cinema version of Das Boot, and it really remains an extraordinary piece of work. Wolfgang Petersen admitted, and I'll come back to this, that he was a bit intimidated by the idea of working with Eastwood, but he duly signed on the dotted line. Now, for long periods of In the Line of Fire, it's a two-hander between the character of Frank Horrigan and the character of Mitch Leary, with Mitch Leary planning to assassinate the President of the United States, who's never referred to by name throughout the film. He's only called Traveller. He's played by Jim Curley, but we never find out the President's name. Nonetheless, the person who was in line for that role was Robert De Niro. And in fact, Robert De Niro was really interested in taking it on. But he had dueling projects going on at that point, and instead of co-starring in The Line of Fire opposite Clint Eastwood, he opted to make his directorial debut, the impressive A Bronx Tale, instead. So the shortlist then, well, Robert Duvall was considered, and Jack Nicholson was also considered to take on the role of Leary. But Eastwood's agent also represented John Malkovich, and ultimately it was the offer that went out to Malkovich, who accepted the role. He would, before filming, basically lock himself away from the world for a month to get into character to take on the role of Mitch Leary. And so this film was coming together. Now, Rene Russo, who plays Lily Raines, and he's excellent in the film, she would come on board fairly late in the day as a studio suggestion. But before we get to that, there's the small matter of which studio was going to back the project. Because Castle Rock, as an independent entity, usually had got his projects funded through New Line Cinema. And there was a credit line in place there, but there's the cost of this particular film. It's going to cost about $40 million. It cost about $40 million to make in the end. Well, New Line didn't have that kind of money available to do this particular film, and this had happened with Castle Rock previously. That Castle Rock had partnered with Columbia Pictures on the aforementioned A Few Good Men, huge box office hit, had won Oscar nominations as well, and so Castle Rock decided to take the picture to Columbia, and Columbia duly did the deal. Now, Columbia were the ones who suggested Rene Russo to co-star in the movie, which was a suggestion that was taken up. But I'm going to come to studio suggestions just in a second, because it caused a little bit of an argument a little way down the line. But the production, as it happened, would turn into a little bit of a taxing one for its lead two stars, for Eastwood and for Malkovich, who both struggled to a degree. Malkovich said he did no training at all for the running scenes in the film, and in fact the extent of his preparation was apparently he put down his cigarette. For Eastwood, he was required to do quite a lot of the action sequences as well. But also, crucially, when the pair do their phone calls together, which were at the heart really of the building tension of the movie, they did their phone calls together. This wasn't a case where one of them came in, recorded their lines, and then the other came in, recorded, had played the other side of the conversation to them. They were on set and doing the call to each other. While every time you see that in the movie. Malkovich, interesting, he talked to the Los Angeles Times around the time of the movie's release, and he was fairly damning on the public's view. Well, let me read you his quote. Quote, "The villain in this story is the general public, which, if you'll excuse me, is intensely stupid. They get the world and the leaders they deserve." Well, I'm just going to leave that there, because obviously there's no contemporary reason that statement should still stand. Cough. The production of the movie also, interestingly, got full cooperation from the Secret Service, and notably it was the first movie production to get that cooperation from the Secret Service. It hadn't happened before. The Bush White House at the time was far less cooperative and less helpful, perhaps unsurprisingly. But one thing the production did get to do was shut down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington in the daytime, which was a huge thing, to shoot the motorcade sequence that we see in the movie. And that was the first thing that was actually shot for the film. And going back to director Wolfgang Petersen, so the film shot in Washington and Los Angeles, and the production began in October 1992. So that shows you how quickly this came together. I mean, the script was sold in April 1992. Within 6 months, they're filming it and shutting down a major street in America. But Wolfgang Petersen, again talking to the Los Angeles Times, said, quote, I must admit I was initially a bit intimidated at the prospect of directing Clint, but any fears I had disappeared after our first meeting, and once we started shooting, he never challenged my direction. And Petersen added, quote, at the beginning he told me, I won't interfere, but if you want my advice, I'll be there for you, otherwise I'll leave you alone. And Petersen did take up that advice quite a lot throughout the production of the movie. Now, the $40 million production, it was completed, went into post-production, and this is where things took a little bit of a turn. Because first of all, there was the promotion of the movie. You might, those of us of a certain vintage, might remember an early trailer for In the Line of Fire having the number 1963. And accompanied by voiceover, the 6 gradually turns into a 9, with the voiceover warning basically, will this happen again? As you hear Mitch Leary talking about how he's going to kill the president. And this trailer was pulled fairly quickly, thanks to some adverse reaction about whether really it was in particularly good taste. There is another, there are sequences in the film which we take for granted now as well, where Clint Eastwood has been digitally inserted into footage of presidential rallies using a younger Clint Eastwood to basically edit him into history. This was hugely expensive, and what happened is they took matching shots of Eastwood from the Dirty Harry films, and they then had to edit him into this archive footage, and this was a really sizable job, to the point where it ate up 10% of the film's production budget. It cost $4 million just to get those shots in the movie. But in the movie, they ended up, and the film started testing, and the test scores for In the Line of Fire were coming back very, very strongly, and it came to a point where it generated a little bit of bad will between Columbia Pictures and Castle Rock that would ultimately spill over, because Columbia wasn't having a good year. 1993 was the year of Last Action Hero, which was assumed to be its huge hit. That hadn't been testing well at all. And so the Castle Rock and Columbia were in partnership. They'd made the deal for the script, they'd agreed the stars and the director, but Columbia hadn't put the film into motion per se, but there was a feeling that the studio was taking more of its credit than it deserved. Now, a bit of background, Sony, who by this point owned Columbia, had also owned 44% of Castle Rock. And it had come in and put up the money 10 weeks before filming was going to start. So it was in many ways the saviour of the film. It did the marketing, it did the distribution. But interestingly, around the time of its release, an article popped up in the Los Angeles Times where there was really some disagreement over who suggested things and who should be taking the credit. And Jeff McGuire would tell the paper that the studio, quote, did come up with some very good suggestions. There were probably a dozen notes they gave us. We adopted some, decided against others. But then he added, I think even they would agree that giving them credit for the picture would be like giving mortgage bankers credit for a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Don't fully get the analogy, but roughly get where he's going. But then Michael Nathanson, who was then Columbia's president of worldwide production, he added that, quote, I think the whole process from day one was entirely a collaborative one, and as the picture took on a life of its own, we were immensely supportive of the process. There was not one step of the way we were not involved in a creative decision or a production decision. And Columbia were the ones who'd suggested changes to the ending to make Eastwood and Rene Russo a little more active in the scenes leading up to the film's climax. But the bad will over just who would take the credit for the film would ultimately, it was ultimately in part said to be responsible for Castle Rock and Columbia splitting in 1994. And in fact, Castle Rock would take The American President, a really good film that I'm going to come to in a future podcast as well, to Warner Brothers. In the case of In the Line of Fire, though, well, there's no glossing over the fact it was a real summer success for Columbia and for Castle Rock in a summer where we had lots of hit thrillers. So this was the summer of The Fugitive, which I've covered before, The Firm, that I'll cover in a future podcast, and on July the 9th, 1993, In the Line of Fire opened to $15 million of box office business and would go on to take $102 million in the US. This was a really good return for the movie. It would add another $80 million worldwide. The only things that kept it off the top of the US box office chart were The Firm in its second week and Jurassic Park in its fifth. That was still motoring, but it did manage to beat Weekend at Bernie's 2 that was on its opening weekend as well. In the Line of Fire, I think, is a really smart and a really good thriller, and a very standalone one, you might think, but for the fact that in 2015 it was revealed a TV spin-off series was being developed. That series hasn't yet happened, but nonetheless you can still find the standalone, really quite excellent In the Line of Fire on streaming services around the world right now, and if you've not had the pleasure, I really suggest you do. And we're at the halfway point of the latest Film Stories podcast. Let me do my traditional bevy of plugs. Film Stories magazine, we have issue 10 is just about to go on sale. You can find all the back issues. You can find details of that at filmstories.co.uk. Also, Film Stories Junior issue 2, our magazine for under 15s. That's out at the end of, mid to end October. So that's going up for pre-order soon as well. And issue 1 is also available. If you like this podcast, it is absolute gold dust to us if you can subscribe to it and also leave hopefully a really positive review. It's the only way really we can get traction is if people help us spread the word, because we don't have a massive marketing budget, and as much as I'd like to tell you that the West Midlands is particularly glamorous on the day that I'm recording this, it's outside and looking miserable and raining an awful lot. But with that, I'm going to move on to the second of the two movies I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm moving into the 2000s. I'm going to play you a clip again from the promo and we'll take it from there.
So who are you?
Wake up today in hospital. I wake up and I'm hallucinating.
I've got some bad news.
They're infected.
Infected!
Father.
Infected with what?
I shouldn't have done that.
It's the blood. There's something in the blood.
Lesson 1. You never go anywhere alone unless you've got no choice.
Hello?
Well, indeed. That is a clip from 2002's 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle. That one was written by Alex Garland. Leading the cast, Cillian Murphy and Naomi Harris, Christopher Eccleston in there as well. And the film was really just something of an anomaly at the time. A British zombie movie, although how zombie you think it is, it has been up for debate since. But actually, its origins lay inevitably slightly earlier, but with a collaboration between Danny Boyle and Alex Garland on the film The Beach. And there's a film ripe again for me to come back to in a future episode of Film Stories. But The Beach was based on the book by Alex Garland, and it turned into a fairly contentious production for an abundance of reasons. But it was the one that brought Garland and Boyle together. And also what Garland saw there, well, the novel of The Beach was adapted for the screen by John Hodge, who's regular collaborator with Danny Boyle, and Alex Garland was an interested bystander of the process of Boyle and Hodge working on the screenplay for the movie, but also crucially working with producer Andrew McDonald. And the whole trio really, and how they gelled and how they bounced off each other and how they managed to move things forward between them. And at this point in his career, Alex Garland was a novelist, and not writing a novel is inevitably far more of a solitary pursuit, and he got quite taken with the idea of something a bit more collaborative, a little less working alone. And that's where he mentioned to McDonald, while production of The Beach was ongoing, that he had this idea for a possible story that involved zombies. And as he would recall in an interview with the Huffington Post that came out in 2015, when Garland had just made what ultimately was his directorial debut, although you can refer back to our the Dread Film Stories podcast if you want a different opinion on that. He'd made Ex Machina at that point, and he talked about working with Andrew McDonald and pitching him that idea. And he said, quote, "When I first sat down to pitch that movie before I wrote the script, which was to Andrew McDonald, the producer, we were sat in a pizza place in a street in London called Charlotte Street, and Garland just said to him, look, I've got an idea for a film. It's about running zombies and it's got daylight and it's in London." And so off the back of that, with McDonald's encouragement, he went and penned a first draft screenplay. They went backwards and forwards quite a lot, with McDonald helping Garland wrap his head around screenwriting and the structure of screenwriting. Garland was from the start not really having an awful lot of shrift about the differences between zombies and the infected in the film, because one of the contentions with 28 Days Later is, can they really be zombies when they're actually running and moving at speed? And that really wasn't a massive concern. Garland was a huge zombie fan, as it happened. He was a huge video games fan as well, and he played likes of Resident Evil, and he watched the Day of the Dead, the George Romero movies, and so he had that in his head as he put his story together. But according to Danny Boyle, the other inspiration that was dug into was the opening sequence of John Wyndham's book The Day of the Triffids, where a man wakes up in hospital to discover that everyone else is blind courtesy of a meteor shower. Whatever the ultimate inspiration that got into Garland's head, he penned what would become 28 Days Later, and he got his spec script into shape. And they did decide that it was better to go less zombies and more this idea of the infected, that there was a feeling that had a bit more of a contemporary feel to it. And I mean, at this stage, in the very early 2000s, there were anthrax scares in the UK, there was mad cow disease, there was foot and mouth disease, and so they really wanted to tap into the fear of a viral infection. In fact, when it came to working out just what that infection was, they used Ebola and the traits of Ebola really as the basis for what they were looking for in their narrative. The project then advanced, and it got to the point where Danny Boyle, after making The Beach, was looking for a new film, and 28 Days Later just looked like just the ticket. He'd had a bit of a bumpy time with his last productions at that point, that A Life Less Ordinary, which I think is an underrated film, had come out in 1997, hadn't really taken the world by storm in the way that was thought. The Beach was a very high profile project, and likewise that one hadn't quite taken off, and so for his next few films, Danny Boyle would come back to Britain. That it would be 28 Days Later. He'd follow it with The Brilliant Millions, which I'll come to at another point, and even Sunshine. He based that very much with British talent and Alex Garland again, as it happened. But in the case of this particular one, Boyle decided that he was going to make the film. Andrew McDonald was going to make the film, and so it was a case of who's going to take the lead role in the movie. And the person who was in pole position for it was Ewan McGregor. But then the furore over The Beach happened. If you don't know the story of what happened with The Beach, Ewan McGregor was all set to take the lead in that movie, having led Danny Boyle's previous two films, Trainspotting and Shallow Grave. But The Beach was a 20th Century Fox big blockbuster production, and the decision was made to go with a movie star instead of Ewan McGregor, and thus Leonardo DiCaprio ended up taking the lead role in The Beach, which it would be fair to say cheesed Ewan McGregor off an awful lot and led to a split in the working relationship between Danny Boyle and Ewan McGregor that wouldn't be fixed until the recent Trainspotting sequel. That they were apart really for a decade or more as a consequence of the fallout over The Beach. With McGregor therefore not taking the lead role in the movie, the question was, well, who would it be? And apparently next on the list was Ryan Gosling, and this was a pre-fame Ryan Gosling, but he'd come to the production's attention, and he, when it came to the point of offering him the role, he too had to duck out of the film, albeit for different reasons. In Ryan Gosling's case, there were scheduling problems that led to him not taking that role on. And then it finally came to Cillian Murphy. who had, it was off the back of his work in films such as Sunburn and The Way We Live Now that really helped him land the role, and he would lead the ensemble of 28 Days Later, along with Naomi Harris and Christopher Eccleston. Eccleston had worked with Danny Boyle on Shallow Grave, of course. This was going to be an ambitious production, though, because whether it felt it or not, and it was a modestly priced film, this needed the scale of an infection taking hold in the UK, and it needed the geographic scale, really, of a big zombie movie and a big disaster movie, almost to a point. And so what Boyle realised was he had to shoot this film in and around the UK, but he needed shots like an empty motorway. He needed major locations in and around Britain to be filmed deserted. And logistically, a Bond movie might have been able to do it, and in fact Bond films have been able to do it in the past, but this was, again, going back to a modestly costed film, and so it would take some ingenuity to get those shots in the proverbial can. As it turned out, it wasn't in the can, it was in the hard drive, because the decision was made to shoot 28 Days Later with digital cameras. Now, that's a fairly natural decision now in 2019 when this has been recorded, but in 2002, which is when the film came out, there were very few films being made with digital cameras because of all sorts of issues, really, that the quality and resolution was not anywhere near the standard that we're used to at the moment. But Boyle figured that would kind of play into the kind of gritty, almost documentary feel that he was looking to get for his movie, and thus he decided that this was going to be the first film he made entirely on digital. But there was a second advantage to him making that choice, because there was almost a guerrilla with a U element to the production that Boyle needed to tap into, that he needed to be in and out of locations very, very quickly to be able to capture the kind of ambitious shots that he needed for his movie. So, for instance, there's a deserted shot of the M1 motorway, and the production team had to turn up early on a Sunday morning, and the police agreed to slow down but not entirely stop the traffic for over a period of 2 hours very early on a Sunday morning. And Boyle apparently used 10 different cameras to get the single minute of usable footage he was able to get out of that. And the 10 cameras is important because by going digital, he realised not only what would he have the flexibility to use that many cameras, but also the setup time was considerably lower. That there wasn't the need to load film, that he could get in and out of a location quickly, which was crucial for what they were looking to do. So there were sequences in the film such as Piccadilly Circus and Westminster Bridge and Oxford Street, and all of those were given very limited time where they were closed off so that the film could get its shots. And again, it was generally under an hour on a Sunday morning, and Boyle could come in, that his crew could shoot the footage, and they would be out, almost to the point of an upturned bus at one point could be in and out in under an hour as well, because they weren't having to faff around with loading filming cameras and with the bulk that comes with shooting on 35mm a lot of the time. Now, Boyle knew that there would be a slight quality issue to it, that you can't hold, particularly in 2002, you couldn't hold the resolution anywhere near what we're used to seeing now, and certainly you couldn't match film, but it worked for the movie. Thus, he was able to get this nimble production together and shot with the kind of shots that we're not used to seeing in fairly mainstream British films, and he was able to pull it together really rather quickly. They shot the film in multiple locations around the UK, as well as some work in Germany in the autumn of 2002. They even used a real hospital at one point. They used a hospital that closed at weekends, and thus hired the hospital out to filmmakers to come in and take and get their material. And so this was not a studio-centric movie by any measure. That Boyle knew that he needed the scale of this to be such that it had to go outdoors an awful lot, and that it duly did. One of the interesting things when it came to the post-production of the movie, though, was the ending. And I only happened upon this story, really, in terms of how it played out in America when I was coming to research this and revisit the film. Because I think it's fairly well known that on the DVD of the movie, there is an alternate ending to the film that's, let's just say, different to the one that you get in the main movie. However, there was a decision to be made over that ending that, whilst it seems that the one we got was always intended for the cinema. When it came to release the film in America, something really unusual happened, in that the movie played out as normal, the ending played out as normal, but then before cinema goers left their seat, they were presented with the alternative ending as part of that showing, in a kind of, well, here's what could have happened if you're looking for a different take on how this story ends. So US cinema goers actually got both endings in the same sitting. And you compare that to something like Clue, which has now been remade. But Clue infamously shipped into American cinemas with three different endings, and whichever reel you got depended what at the screening you were at, depended the ending you got. You didn't know until you got to the end of the movie. In the case of 28 Days Later, there were two endings, but in America you got them both, and there was some pushback on that and some criticism of the decision. But in the UK, you can watch it on the DVD and make your own mind up. Now, when the film was released in the UK, and it arrived on the 1st of November 2002, it was released by Fox Searchlight, and this film that had cost around $8 million or so to make, if you translate it to American dollars, turned into a hit. That the reviews for the movie were really positive. I mean, it was in profit off the UK box office alone, although that doesn't necessarily factor in the cinema take, etc., but certainly off the UK business. By the time the video and DVD, well, the DVD sales were counted in, it was in profit. What was also a surprise was it became quite a hit in America. In fact, it became a really quite big surprise hit, grossing $45 million in the US when it was ultimately released over there. But the reviews were positive as well. And even now the affection for the film is strong. There was that debate over whether they're zombies, whether they're infected, if they're the same thing, if you can really have your cake and eat it there. But the audience response to it was warm as well, and the film picked up a fair few awards around the world on its travels as well. It was a hit to the point where there was talk fairly quickly about a follow-up, because there was an impact to 28 Days Later. It wasn't just that it came out and it was a hit, it also was part of a resurgence of zombie/infected movies that were coming out at the same time. So Zack Snyder did his really good Dawn of the Dead remake. The Resident Evil films were kicking off at this point. Shaun of the Dead followed not long after, although I'm not suggesting there's a direct link between 28 Days Later and Shaun of the Dead. But there was talk of doing a follow-up movie, to the point where they decided to press ahead with it, although both Danny Boyle and Alex Garland would take on producer roles on that particular film. That the screenplay for that one would be written by Rowan Joffe, Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, E.L. Levine and Jesus Olmo, and it was Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, off the back of a film called Intacto, who was given the job of making 28 Weeks Later. And to the surprise of many, 28 Weeks Later is a really quite good film as well, to the point where talk continues about a further entry in the series, that there's talk about doing 28 months later. A lot of the talk is fueled by press junkets, as lots of these things are, that every time Danny Boyle has a new film out, as he did with Yesterday earlier this year, someone tends to ask him about it, but he never shoots it down, and he's always expressed an interest in revisiting and making the 28 days, weeks, months a trilogy with Alex Garland's involvement. For Garland's part, he's now an acclaimed film director, of course, off the back of Annihilation, Ex Machina and Dread, depending where you stand on that particular one. And so maybe he would be the likely candidate for the next film. What I really like about 28 Days Later, though, is it stands up, and also at the start of the 2000s, no one was making big mainstream films like this in Britain. They were certainly making rom-coms. Hugh Grant was a big movie star, but in terms of let's go make a zombie movie in the UK with a real scale to it, well, hats off to all concerned. Not only did they it, they made a huge success of it, and we're still talking about a third entry in the series today. And that's been the latest episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod, which now covers a website that we're updating pretty much daily with news and features. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories, where you'll find an abundance of video-only exclusive film stories, not a million miles away from what you're listening to now. Facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. And you you can find out about our magazines, both of them, and you can order copies. And you can also find out about our next upcoming live tour date, which is taking place in Belfast in October, over at the website www.filmstories.co.uk. But for those of you here with the podcast, thank you as always for your support. Thank you for listening. I'll be back with you again soon with a whole other bunch of film stories. You take care. Bye bye.